Big hand for Meadow. Yay. It's great to be back here. I haven't been here in a hot minute. So I hope everybody had a joint. I did not, so that I can speak articulately. Although I am good at, smoking and being productive. So I know a lot of y'all. I am really excited to moderate this panel and talk about how we can find a path forward in sort of merging from a strategic values perspective. So we have to go down the panel, Cassia Furman with Vicente Sederberg, Lara DeCaro from Leland, Parachini, Steinberg, Matzger, and Melnick. Lots of people's last names. LPS, there we go. And Alfredo Barreto from JMP Securities, who I just learned has done pretty much all of the IPOs for cannabis-related businesses. So anyway, and I'm Joyce. I sort of run a family office that's done a bunch of investments in the space. We haven't done any in a minute because, venture capital in the space is a little bit paused, but we also run a farm called Sonoma Hills Farm. So let's get into it. Do you guys first want to kind of introduce each of yourselves? I didn't do a great job of that. I think there's microphones on the ground. Yeah. Or here you go.
Does that mean I have to go first?
Yes, it
Okay.
does.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm Cassia. I'm primarily cannabis attorney, and I'm coming up here today from beautiful Santa Monica, bringing that SoCal weather with me, I guess, because I feel like I'm at the beach, but it's good vibes here. Been working in cannabis for quite a while. Our firm has offices around the country, so we've had the privilege of working with companies big and small in trying to scale and get financing and navigate an ever-changing landscape. So just really privileged to be here today, and thank you so much for having us. Excited for the combo.
Hey. Good, it's on. Hi, I'm Lara DeCaro. I'm an attorney here in San Francisco. I've been practicing cannabis business law for about 14 years in this market. So sort of seen it all. Where we say we've seen it all, and then something new happens. And it's like, surprise, you haven't seen it all. There's more we can throw at you. So it's a really interesting time for me to be watching the growth of this market and some would say maturation or development, but just watching it move into a more socially accepted space, a more sort of normal space, and I love it. I like the way that we're approaching the market as a community, especially the people I see in this space, and knowing that you all are moving this forward on this level gives me a lot of hope for our future as the cannabis community, because we could get lost if we don't all stick together.
Testing. Hi, everyone. My name's Alfredo Barreto with JMP Securities here in San Francisco. I have worked in the consumer sector, consumer packaged goods, retail, food, beverage, agriculture, as an investment banker for the last 20 plus years. I joined the JMP Securities firm after some time at both Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, and I joined to help expand the cannabis practice. JMP Securities is known for its deep relationships in the technology sector and the life sciences, and I joined to help expand that practice into cannabis. We've been involved in a handful of financings, including Weed Maps, Leafly, Trees, and a number of other ancillary businesses, but have also worked with growers, distributors, and manufacturers in cannabis. So looking forward to this discussion as this emerging market continues to perplex us all.
So the origination of California cannabis, a lot of companies had been in the medical market and probably had, less taxation, less regulatory rigor, less necessity for outside services and whatnot. So a lot of companies kind of, started out with, I like to say, some money buried in the ground. And there was a big venture frenzy. So if you had a competent business model and you were, well situated to be able to step into a license, there was likely going to be somebody that was going to give you money on a promissory, future forward thing. So the early days, kind of, I would say, ended in mid 2019. And then sort of the next chapter, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the Canadian exchange, sort of forwarded for, exit values early for companies. And sort of, from my perspective, I'm sort of like, why did we ever think that it was only going to take 2 years for us to exit? And what could have been the potential synergy with an exchange to actually give companies longevity? So let's baseline the conversation on the Canadian thing and what that looked like from that perspective, if we could. Anybody can weigh on this because I think a few of you have had impact here.
I would just comment that the fact that Canada legalized at the federal level made for the money flow and the capital flow to happen, and so we saw a lot of companies tap the public markets, access cash, and grow. But Canada is small. Canada is smaller than California. And I think investors were expecting the Canadians to corner the whole North American market, and that wasn't going to happen. So I think we saw essentially an accelerated boom in Canada, and then United States has had to slowly implement a broad set of regulations on a state-by-state basis. So we've had to watch the Canadian companies access the cash and capital that the United States would love to have access to if and when we're federally legal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good point. I have done a few transactions involving Canadians, and all I can say is it's rather dysfunctional. I would probably stay away from getting involved in a publicly traded Canadian company right now, or working with one without talking to those who've already undergone that process. So if you're approached by a publicly traded Canadian company or a Canadian company that's potentially planning on going public, I would want to reach out to those who've had experience with them right now, because they are imploding. And I do think that Canada is oversaturated on some levels. They're investing a lot in California right now in laboratories, which is an interesting business model and I think might help bode well for them. But insofar as a retail operation, I'm not seeing a whole lot of continued interest from the Canadian companies. And in fact, one of the Canadian companies that I have done some work with is dumping some projects. So it's become less attractive. They got the first bump, right? They got the ability to play ball first, and they ran with it. And now they, I think, are regretting a lot of the investments that they underwent. But we shall see how all that pans out. There were a lot of smaller U.S.-based companies that were talking about doing sort of reverse IPO things with Canadian companies, and none of that panned out. There's just been a lot of talk about it. And until we really get some movement on the federal front with regard to safe banking, we're not going to see a whole lot of that sort of public activity insofar as I think U.S. assets are concerned.
Yeah, just to add to that for operators who might be out there, the one implication that the Canadian pubcos may have for you, a lot of the MSOs are listed in Canada, including some that are very active in California. In Harborside is technically a Canadian company, so when we talk about that, they're not all like visitors from the north. But an implication of being a public company is if they're looking to acquire retail, which has been a pretty classic model for them, and even though the heady days are long past us, they're still trying to grow because they have to, the ones that have good enough balance books to keep it going. They bought a lot of retail last year, less this year, but I know there's some delivery and some retail folks out there. And I guess the advice beyond what Lara gave, which is really solid, is when you're dealing with the public company, you have to play ball on their terms, and getting ready for the deal, it can be a lot more involved than what you might be waiting for. I don't know if I think the earlier session covered some of the prep stuff, but getting the books together, the audited financial records and all that stuff is mandatory with any of those companies. And a lot of them are still trying to grow and consolidate, even though their balance books aren't what they were. So it's not without question that they could come knocking.
Yeah, exactly. I think they could come knocking, but I don't think they're not as interested in California anymore. I mean, what I'm seeing is a lot of interest in the South and in the Northeast, yeah, a bit less in California. But I think we talked about this on the first panel a little bit too. Sorry.
I'm going to weave this into some like DCC required conversations, and we'll come back to SPACs in a moment. But relative to, the Harborside, obviously they just launched their San Francisco spot on, what is it, Stanton, I think. So that did have a social equity applicant on it. So I'm interested in terms of like those of us that have operating businesses, we apply into Excella and we have to put our cap tables in there and sort of expose people that have over 20%, ownership in our companies. So how, and like, I guess if you're building your business on the front end and you have your operating agreement and you start to take in outside capital, like, what does that look like in terms of how you need to frame that, both to the Department of Cannabis Control and then, kind of locally? And I guess this is sort of a broad question in terms of like if it's a public company or if it's, just a big outside investor. I think the requirement with the SEC is what, 10%? So the whole Elon Musk thing that's happening, right? Like, he, had to declare once he got really high. So the 20% bar is the DCC, 10%, sort of otherwise. So, what does that look like in terms of paperwork filing and setting ourselves up to be transparent?
Well, I don't know that the DCC itself has showed a lot of interest in this topic over the years. Technically you're supposed to keep those ownership disclosures current within 14 days. But where we have seen it be an issue, because they've never said anything basically to any of our clients, no matter if they filed late, never, on time, is it becomes a very big deal, in M&A sometimes, not from a regulator perspective in California, but from in the eyes of the diligence team on the acquiring party. And it can be a real problem if you don't have your, cap tables updated and there's multiple, LICOT7s pending with the DCC, and the buyer or, investor comes in and it's just like, your disclosures are not current. You're not a good person. You're not a good operator. I've seen people, really turned off of deals because operators didn't have their paperwork current. More to say.
Yeah, no, I totally agree about that. I mean, simplification of your cap table is sort of number one. You have to understand what's on that cap table so that you can understand what this merger or acquisition or joint venture or whatever is going to end up looking like on the back end. But for regulators, They don't really care. I mean, when we got new, I know, right? In the locals care. I would say that the local regulators care far more than the state regulators. And, I've literally been told by state regulators that we're over disclosing. They're like, okay, wait. If they don't fall within this actual definition, I don't want to know who they are. So don't give me your entire cap table.
Don't give me
Deep breath. Right? Was taken. At that time, we said, all right, I'll give you what you want. You always give the regulators whatever they want, right? But they haven't been asking for it. And even when we had a slight change, the modification in the DCC's rules with regard to the definition of owner re-expanded last year under the proposed consolidation rules. I asked, we kind of got together, a few lawyers. We were like, well, are you going to tell your clients to, file a Form 27 and update their ownership list with the DCC? And we all then turned to clients and said, well, what are you going to do? You should, we think you should do this just to be technically compliant. And they were like, yeah, no, we're not going to do it. They don't care. We send stuff to them. They don't respond. We're not going to bother, and we'll do it on renewal. And it's just a pain for them to comply. So it's interesting to see how I think that information's already trickled out into the community as to what the DCC is really looking for, what sort of things that operators need to focus their time and limited resources on. And it seems to me that that's just not one of them right now. But you should do it for your own internal purposes, I should reiterate.
Especially if you want to be acquired or have a more sophisticated party invest in you, because literally every other state in the country, this is like do or die territory. You have to disclose accurately. And so it can be tough for California folks who are used to our system, having those conversations with outside investors. And a lot of the companies that are interested in investing in California are not from here or have interest in other states and are used to a regulated cannabis industry that's essentially a compliance game where if you do well enough at compliance, you can sell some weed at the end of the day. And California has kind of been the opposite model. So you just need to know that it's out there and be prepared to deal with it when it comes your way.
Yeah, and I think for any market in California, that really sort of underscores the need to engage with people who are doing the work wherever you want to operate, right? Get to know people. There are resources out there. There are people out there. Any one of us, I'm sure, would talk to people, at the drop of a hat, and just to share information about stuff like this. I mean, that's what we're here for, right? Not just today, but every day. We're here to help each other along. And I feel that one of the mistakes is people try to go this alone. They don't reach out. They don't try to ask those questions, and then they end up making a mistake and not engaging with the local regulator.
I would just simply add that if you're interested in selling, you need to have accurate books. And that includes all the necessary compliance issues. And whether it's working with the DCC or working with highly professional attorneys like we have up here on the panel, that'll help you. But essentially, the buyer's going to look for a tight ship. They want to make sure that the value that they're going to pay for your business is secured by the accurate books and records that you have. So that's the commentary from the high-level banker over here.
Good advice.
So California is its own, culture, and obviously we have a lot of different even identities in San Francisco. So in terms of if there is an outside party and acquisition potential from a group that has a totally different, geographic or I'm going to use the example of retail. If somebody from an MSO wants to acquire here locally, what in terms of like the mechanism for how they take over that deal, first and foremost, like what is the smoothest mechanism? I mean, let's speak to like specific contractual terms and whatnot. But in addition to that, how can the operator sort of keep their identity in the deal so that, the brand identity of that retail shop isn't completely dissipated within the transaction?
Okay. Hand the mic to you, Lara.
Okay. Well, we could talk about, should we talk about...
Should we talk about our dorky 33 to...
The 33 to 16? We could talk about that. But I think,
More broadly.
more broadly, I worked on the first such transaction in San Francisco, right? And it was, an Article 33 MCD that, was obviously still under Article 16 regulatory compliance obligations. So we really had to navigate both sets of rules, which meant also engaging both sets of regulators. I was a general counsel for this company and for the MCD, and they were approached. We came to terms. I worked really closely with this MSO, publicly traded Canadian company, for a long time as we hammered out and we kind of navigated what the rules were and what they were going to look like. And I thought that was fantastic, because what they did is they put their trust in the target, right? They said, you are, you're doing this right. Clearly, we want to acquire you, and so you tell us how best to get this done. We ended up bringing in another co-counsel, and then eventually got to the point where I said, okay, you guys now need your own lawyer. I'm not advising you on that anymore. And we pulled in actually Nicole Howell, who so graciously provided that due diligence checklist for you here today, but to help represent the MSO, and it was fantastic. They listened to us on, which counsel to bring in. They listened to us on which regulators to meet. So that perspective was super refreshing, because prior to that experience, we had been approached by several potential buyers, and most of them were U.S.-based, traditional VC kind of guys, who engaged lawyers at MoFo or Wilson Sonsini or one of those other big sort of VC $1,000 an hour lawyer firms, right? That doesn't do cannabis. And so we had gone through a series of transactions where these lawyers just wouldn't believe that you couldn't pull up an NVCA template and press print and it would work for a cannabis transaction. No matter how much we talked to them about this. So what was refreshing was the Canadian approach, and I think that is actually the most seamless way to approach it. Convince this potential buyer or merger candidate, right, that you know what you're talking about and you understand your local market. And if they're not willing to hear that message, it's maybe not the right mix. But that was, I think, the best thing that could have happened was the way that they approached the transaction. And it really led to a very easy, seamless deal. We all worked together countless hours on trying to navigate the various rules under which we had to navigate. And it ended up working out. So for that transaction, it was great.
Yeah, just to add to that, Lara and I both work with a number of social equity operators, and we were talking before the session a little bit. There's been some differences between those early days that I've seen, and it's still, every deal is different, and every prospective buyer or investor has different expectations, as do the social equity qualifying individuals. But early on in LA, when they were starting to talk about social equity retail applications, I'd say the majority of the people who approached us just wanted like a blank check, like, I want a side letter and take all the money, and I talked to this person and they're cool with it. They don't want the worry of running the business, etc. And, you got to say, no, that's not what the program's intended to do. They're not going to accept those documents. that's not in the spirit of the program. And in the past couple of years, we've seen some, because of the grassroots efforts of many folks from within this community and in other communities around California, as well as nationally, that perspective kind of change, where now you're seeing some of the larger companies buy in to the wholesale idea, and there's just a lot more conversation that this could be a deal that both parties can benefit from, and both parties can come to the table and take something away and build something together. And tapping into that California culture, although the MSOs aren't perhaps looking at retail as much in California or delivery, they're very much, looking and, beyond MSOs too. I've just seen more people be a little bit more genuine about their interest and about the terms, as well as more of the social equity folks. And part of that is because they've been fixing the definitions. And I'm sure a lot of you are involved in the state efforts to adopt the definition of social equity that's going to hopefully eliminate some of the concerns around who's receiving these benefits and be a model for the rest of the country. If we can do that collectively, which is on the table now, I talked to Yvette McDowell a couple days ago, one of the women working on the effort and a mentor of mine, I could say. And she said, it's hurting cats like everything else in Sacramento, but there's some real need and momentum behind that. And I think that's a really positive indicator moving forward in terms of investment opportunities for social equity businesses too. So although there's a lot of bad stories and a lot of sleepless nights, especially for the operators, but also for people trying to help the businesses and, listen to what the operators need, there's some positive direction, and people are picking up those conversations too.
I would just simply add that or oftentimes when we're working with a company that's looking to sell or raise capital, in the case of selling, say for example it's a retail chain, we'll want to make sure that we truly understand the key cultural issues that have built that brand. So, we'll just take an example of cookies, for example, right? They have a clear message they want to send with regards to the retail experience, the whole setting. And if they want to sell the business, we need to understand the value of that brand and what, if anything, they're willing to do with that brand under ownership of another company. So we would spend a lot of time making sure we understood exactly what the brand, the company represents, make sure that the financial parameters of revolving around value are within the range of what we think is reasonable, and then we would look at all the social, cultural issues and make sure that the buyer is going to honor that, and or if they are going to make changes, that they're within reason of what the sellers are looking for. So, and oftentimes that'll create a situation in which you have a very high bidder, but they may come in and completely change things. And that's not necessarily what the seller wants to happen. And so we may end up taking a lower offer, but retain all of the other social and cultural issues that that brand or that seller wants to get paid for.
Yeah, I like how you brought it back to that question, because that's a big deal, I think, is obviously brand loyalty, especially in the California market. And also another thing I would want to talk about is if you are operating in multiple states, if you've licensed your brand to other states, to take a good look at, your licensing agreements, because if you're acquired in one jurisdiction, it doesn't mean that you can be or will be acquired in another jurisdiction. So you may have some rebranding issues, and you want to take a look at that as you move into other states so that your license agreements are fully equipped to deal with that kind of piecemeal transactional, I don't know how to describe it, fracturing, right, of your stores or your brand, so that you can maintain control. But that is something that does come up. One of the things I think we need to give kudos to the Office of Cannabis, and specifically Eugene Hillsman, for really enforcing those social equity terms here in San Francisco and laying the groundwork for expected compliance. It wasn't like lip service. You heard a lot about Los Angeles just playing lip service, and there was lack of enforcement. And I think that Eugene killed a couple of deals because he just wouldn't play ball with the investors when the investors were intentionally trying to undermine the rights of the social equity applicant. And so we really, that's good and bad, I suppose, right? But we really need to recognize how that led the conversation in San Francisco, and now you can't even apply for a license here unless you have one of the legacy or social equity criteria, until we have 50% of that license category held by social equity, right? And it's actually kind of nice, but it does make you more attractive as an acquisition target. So keep that in mind.
I'd like to hear from Joyce on this topic. This lady's a wealth of information.
I guess, I've invested personally in 12 deals, and I operate a company. And I think about the deals that I've invested in as partners of mine, the subscription of you don't kill the golden goose. You don't kill the goose because the goose will give everybody eggs. And I think in this most recent chapter with the dry up of a lot of the venture and equity path, folks have, kind of taken a path to going to certain debt facilities that aren't, in theory, usurious or predatory, like by legal definition, but by the business practice of those companies, they are squeezing everything that there is to keep the growth there. And at the end of the day, California is the biggest global market, period. And well, Germany, fine, yes. But right now, today, and it's the one that, obviously drives so much. People aren't going to talk about Germany, weed, Lara, come on. I guess at the end of the day, California, we owe it to each other as operators here to stand up for efficacy and quality within California, sort of at the expense of an immediate, exit strategy. And I'm young, right? So some investors that I brought around our holdings are not young. And so understanding both sides of the conversation, what people are expecting to get out of it, it's just kind of something people didn't do. And I was always what the actual, what do you really expect from me? Do you want me to be in this deal for 5 years, 8 years, 12 years, the rest of my fucking life? That's not going to happen. So people just need to be more transparent. It's not that hard. It is hard when you're an operator and you get this complex legal document and you have no idea what all the hooks are and whatnot. And so it's awesome, y'all, that there are resources. But what I will say to those resources is brokers don't talk to companies that are making less than $1 million a year, unless their exit is going to be a 7-figure opportunity for them, like it's moot, So there have been certain smaller pools that are trying to, kind of, I guess, through a consolidation effect across a given category, like look at financing solutions. But at the end of the day, I just feel like we need to be a little bit more proactive about how we think about merging with other companies that we're aligned with, as opposed to finding ourselves in a position where we need to Hail Mary because our business is going to be on its face. So what I say to people is put your ego at the door. We are stewards for this plant. No offense, none of us are special. She's special. So if you're going to make money and be her voice and have a profession, work collaboratively with people that share a demographic focus, that have supply chain stickiness with you, and don't step on their toes. Don't vertically integrate your little brand and launch a delivery service and then launch a distribution service and then launch a retail outlet. Like, partner with somebody that actually does that and be reasonable. And I will draw this into a question to say, what does it look like if I, as a business, want to retain the value that, I put on the board and I say, this is where I want my life to go over the next 5 years. This is where I think is reasonable for me and my family. You've got this business. We can engage and draw common value together. What does that look like for you? If I wanted to merge with somebody else, like, how would I do that in a way that protects their cap table, protects my cap table, and doesn't, sort of invite a predatory player to, incentivize them in some way after the transaction happens to dilute my value? It's a hard question.
Your comments made me think about a conversation I had that you facilitated visiting the CEO of Cannabis. And the basic topic was, what do you want to do? Where do you want to take this business? And it ended up revolving around the competitive landscape. Cannabis had a solid brand, good production, grower, but they didn't have leverage at retail. And it became clear that the solution for getting Cannabis to the next stage was to possibly merge with somebody who had retail. And that's effectively what happened. I wasn't involved in identifying that partner, but Cannabis had a portfolio of assets and attributes that had gotten them to where they were. And now the market had changed. Other MSOs had come into California. Brands are individually getting bigger, and the distributors were exerting a fair amount of power. So in this case, the answer was we needed to compete and fill out our portfolio to keep growing and eventually get public or what have you. So that's a real world recent example, and what I'm observing is that many of the public MSOs are, for the first phase or the most recent phase of the development of this industry and this market, or the cannabis industry, was a lot of white space, meaning people needed to get into different geographies. They needed to lock in their supply chain and retail channels, and then they can compete. But things keep moving for all of us. The local dispensary now has more competition, and as Joyce is indicating, you need to collaborate and try to build the value of the asset that you have, whether it's a brand, a store, distributor, et cetera. So I see this as a developing market, And we're in that phase where M&A now seems to be the best alternative for the smaller players. And think of yourselves as, how do I fit into the portfolios of these other players from a strategic point of view? Raising capital is sort of a different game, but there's similar positioning that you need to think about as to what makes you attractive to that investor or buyer.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I would also add in, so far as the question relates to the cap table and the merger component specifically. So just to kind of back up a little bit, you know, a merger is usually an exchange of stock. That's generally the way that a merger is handled. I mean, there can be other structures, but that's the most common, at least insofar as like the legal terminology is involved. An acquisition would usually involve cash and or stock and both. And so when you're looking at these two cap tables, that's where using an app like you referenced earlier is going to be a lot more efficient for memorializing and trying to streamline what your cap table actually looks like, because I've tried to spreadsheet those things and I get lost, you know, and I'm kind of trained to do it. So sometimes a lot of these apps can help you integrate a really holistic picture of what this is going to look like for all of the players when you merge these cap tables, and it can help, you know, both sides ascertain whether this is a good deal for you, because it'll really break it down. And so that's something I would recommend, is kind of moving away from Excel and getting an app. And, you know, especially if you've done a number of raises, or if you have a series of safes out there that could implement, really implement a change, right, to the bottom line and result in far less founders' equity being present than you originally perceived.
Yeah, so is like common shares, do they transition in a merger, or do you have to like reset the ESOP? And what happens with the preferences if one is 1.5 and one is 1, and what happens there?
Usually like a fractionalized, a fractionalized share is usually calculated downward, or it's bought out, right? But I think that a lot of it depends on the fiduciary responsibilities with regard to the type of transaction too, because you're looking at various number of scenarios that you just alluded to. So you need to investigate whether you're talking about an LLC, a corporation, what jurisdictions, so that you can really examine what your obligations are to the various shareholders. And then you may have an investor rights agreement in place that modifies those, or you might have, you know, bylaws or an operating agreement, depending on whether you have a corporation or an LLC. So it's a lot of due diligence to try to figure that out. And I think it is a really complicated analysis, and that's where the apps come in really handy, because they can really break it down for you. I don't know, do you think? Do you agree?
I just to add on to this, if I get a license tomorrow and I know I want to get acquired in 2 years, like, what do you suggest in terms of how I form the corporation and how to keep it clean to make it very easy for a future merger?
I don't know. I like what Will was talking about earlier. I think it was Will. I was Karen. I don't know. A little bit about the structure looking like an umbrella, you know, where you've got your holding company up here, and it's probably a corporation, and in part you want that because it's a more traditional investment vehicle, but also in part because the corporation is taxed, and that then cuts off personal liability under 280E and other taxes that you might be subjected to. But then holding the licenses in individualized LLCs. And I would recommend, like I would if you owned a series of buildings in any geographic region, that you hold your licenses in separate LLCs. I mean, just diversification of risk. It's basic 101. Don't get a bunch of licenses unless you're getting a micro, right? Don't get a bunch of licenses under one company name. That would be my.
Yeah, and it's always kind of tough at the beginning of a company because you don't want to create additional unneeded expense with having so many entities, especially in California where it's so expensive on an annual basis. My in-laws have real estate holdings, and they're like all still in their personal names after 40 years because they don't want to pay for LLC franchise taxes in California. It's crazy. I used to live in Colorado, and it was like $25 to register an LLC, and you were done. It's a little different story here. So you kind of want to consider what's realistic in terms of multiple entities and debt structure and keep things as simple as possible. But if you are looking at potential expansion, I mean, the other entity is probably the IP licensing vehicle that has a lot of flexibility for cannabis companies, and if you can build some value in your brand through ancillary stuff, whether it be tech or merch or any kind of goodwill that you can then potentially look at doing licensing deals, which Lara alluded to, and I work on a lot. I'm sure you do with our clients. It's probably half of what I do most days. And there's states opening left and right, and people who are looking for expertise and looking for solid brands. That's a good idea too. On the finance side, I think you could probably speak to that best.
Yes, moderating, passing the buck. Yeah, no, C Corp, and then hold the licenses in an LLC, and generally have a separate IP structure and do licensing deals in other states is kind of the way that we've done it. But it does get complicated in terms of usually you'll set up some sort of perpetual license to be able to access the brand, and then the deriving origin of where that brand gains traction, like how you value that when you then take it to another state, that has been, I don't have an answer to that. I'm kind of in the middle of figuring that out. I think we all are at this point. So in terms of seeking mergers or seeking partners in other states, I want to go back to the panel and ask what you guys suggest in terms of, who we could tap to sort of find who's looking out there in the world for new partners. But to kind of add to that, I've been observing kind of, what's happening on the East Coast. I'm from Georgia. Georgia's this, I don't know, it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. So, I've taken really small positions in a few companies in states that I care about because I want to just get to know people in those states and start understanding other operators. So I was an early investor in Sava. It's a really good delivery retail service, and it built its own technology stack. So kudos to Meadow. Love Meadow's stack. They built their own. And relative to what my thoughts are in terms of their growth, it's okay, maybe this makes sense from a brand perspective in New York. So just starting to kind of, I get the DC say they'll process out every new license, and it's standing. I get them for cultivation. I get them for retail. You can get that in most other states. So you can start to do, I'm not a macros Excel person, so I'm not super, formulaic about it, but you can start to get, inbound emails to tell you who's activated those licenses. Sometimes it's a little difficult to understand what brand is on top of the shell, because most people are smart and originate LLCs in non-look-through places. But usually with a little Google magic, you can start to figure out like who is what. So that's a trick that I've used to try and start to understand like who's doing what in New Jersey and Massachusetts and New York and whatnot, and just literally like inbounding them on their websites. Because I think like from a natural growth perspective, money's not coming to California for a minute. It's going to come back, y'all, like we're, in a big state. But I think if you need to go find outside capital right now in advance of a merger, you should be looking to do a licensing deal in one of the new states, and then that, is going to add a lot of top line value. But what that looks like, given that, we're a little bit more on the foundational floor than certain other states, and how you contractually sort of build that, you need to seek that from experts and parties. So what are some of the resources? Obviously you guys are great resources, but if somebody doesn't necessarily have access to a retainer, or looking for a large 7-figure acquisition, like where can they go?
So the International Cannabis Bar Association has resources of attorneys that are like active in cannabis all over the world. They have like 900 members. And you can go to their website and be connected with an attorney. And, there are obviously some that are working in the pro bono sector. So to your question about whether if you don't have a retainer available to engage an attorney, a lot of them will at least give you a couple of hours of their time, right? And then lead you to a local resource for pro bono activity. Bar Association of San Francisco has a verified equity applicant pro bono legal project that we started. So there are lawyers there that are designated to give you free advice if you are a verified equity applicant in San Francisco. You can't take up all their time, but they want to give you the best tools, that you have moving forward, and think that there are a lot of bar associations that run pro bono projects. And I would start there, in the community that you've identified as wanting to get into, and then networking out, right, with the attorneys that you meet through those organizations, I think.
I think networking with attorneys, business brokers, investment bankers, attending conferences of this nature that put you in touch with folks that can help you execute, whether it's a sale or a merger. It's easy to do a 1 + 1 = 2. If you can identify a handful of buyers or investors that turn it into a 1 + 1 = 3 or 2.5, that's where you're going to get the incentives, structured in the deal for everybody. So it sounds counterintuitive, but depending on what size your operation is, if you're on the smaller side, think about your competitor. If your competitor with 2 or 3 units on the retail side, makes an interesting geographic, position for you. That's the kind of design or synergies that you can begin to explore and try to get a deal on the table. And then we can help you figure out the right structure. But sometimes it's kind of simple. It's like, who would I like to, dance with, and where can we make some more music and get this plant out to people. So networking, talking to advisors, and then just thinking logically, where can I create some more value with another party?
Yeah, for sure. Just anecdotally, when Nevada was starting to go live, I had done some work with Senator Sederberg at the time, and I had classmates from law school who lived in Vegas. So my clients tapped me. They're like, "Hey, Lara, we'll fly you to Vegas if you just introduce us to some people." And it worked out really well for everybody. We all found partners to take home from the dance, and it was a lot of fun in the making. So you can really just take advantage of the relationships you have and just capitalize. People will know people in this industry because it is still pretty tight, I think.
Oops, sorry, it's on your foot. Yeah, and even in new markets, like everybody's talking about the East Coast, obviously, it's still going to be a real estate game. So everybody's got a second cousin somewhere who, might have, down on hard times industrial building maybe. Because consider that California real estate isn't really the norm for the rest of the country, too. I mean, I used to work in California, and when legalization happened there was during the last recession. Maybe we're about to have another recession, or at least a bear market. But at the time, there was all sorts of Class C industrial buildings that were, underutilized or sitting vacant or full of rats in the outskirts of Denver. And, the legal cannabis industry powered real estate revitalization of those areas. And, overall, the real estate markets have been pretty strong nationally in the past couple of years, but finding a location is still kind of number one, even in the new states. And that's where starting with your network is kind of the best place to start, even for a licensing deal. In some cases, because you can start putting together these people. Okay, I've got a property. I met someone who's qualified as social equity, because all the delivery licenses in these new markets, or at least the initial ones, and lots of other license types too, are being designated, for people who have certain qualifying credentials. And so you start putting together a team of like-minded people who have, similar goals and values. Everything always looks good at the beginning, but if you have some pretty good contracts backing you up, then you're about as well positioned as you could hope for.
I'm going to stay on that track for a second, and we'll get to questions. Relative to the real estate, before you have a license, it's just real estate. So, trying to position yourself with a landlord to get, a future purchase price before you get that license, and trying to get a bank loan before you get that license. Great idea. To speak to the, maybe potential recession that's coming, I just wanted to, kind of put this out there that banks are not going to have as many people to lend to. Commercial activity will slow down. People are going to stop purchasing houses at the frequency that they have been. So I believe, and I'm starting to see this personally, that I think there's going to be an era to come where certain regional banks, mainly credit unions and legal markets, are going to start to lend to people that have collateral. So what is that collateral? Real estate is the best. But perhaps there's, potential for packaging, factoring. I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but do not do the bespoke deal. It is not going to be good for your long-term business. So a factoring model that's actually like a little bit more realistic to what traditional CPG companies like, I would love to see, somebody come out with that. And I think that there would be banks that would maybe, through like a consolidated effort, if a bunch of people are sourcing similar packaging or have similar inventory needs, that could be something that we can shake out even in advance of safe banking. Relative to rolling back a distressed debt structure, any thoughts or comments on how somebody might do that if they're finding themselves in a situation where they maybe did a deal they shouldn't have done on the debt side?
There are a number of family offices that are still looking at sort of distressed debt situations. And then there are other general distressed investors that are beginning to look at the cannabis space. But they're far and few between. just a quick side story. We raised close to $50 million for Trees, which is a POS ancillary cannabis business. And when we first went out to market, we targeted half cannabis investors and half non-cannabis investors. And at the end of the day, it was 99% non-cannabis investors. And this marketing process started last December and finished in about March. And so the only key comment there is if you're not a cannabis investor and been on the sideline, there hasn't been anything in the news to get people to go into cannabis. So it's going to need to be a cannabis-specific, distressed situation investor is my current recommendation.
Yeah, my experience with this is that, these investors are really smelling blood in the water. And so rolling it back isn't necessarily going to be the end result. I think you're going to end up, when you engage with a lot of these distressed asset investor types, you're going to end up agreeing to a deal that on paper looks like you maintain some control of your company, but in reality is basically a full acquisition for payment of that debt that you've accumulated. So I would be really careful getting into those conversations. But sometimes there's no other out, right? Sometimes you just need that out. But that's been my experience in how those have gone. The other thing I did kind of want to talk about is the people that you're working with. I mean, one of the constant themes, right, that we have going on in this panel, I think, is like finding your tribe. Figure out who you actually want to be in business with. Like, who is it that you can actually see yourself going to dinner with in a couple of years? Who do you want at your kid's birthday party? I don't know. I mean, whatever your criteria are, it's you find your tribe time when you're talking to all these people, because if you're not aligned on ethical and social or governance, you're going to find yourself being pushed out on some level pretty easily. And so you just need to protect yourself against that. I had one recent conversation with a social equity applicant that told me that their incubator had essentially offered to pay for their legal fees for the review of some contract, and then they chose the lawyer for the equity applicant. And it was a lawyer that I know for a fact does not have the most equity-aligned perspective on business deals in the area where this took place. And that kind of stuff will happen if you're just not aligned, I think, on a more moral level with the people that you're talking to.
I think one other point on that topic, we're seeing trying to avoid that distressed asset restructuring because there's not very many good options, create some of these large mergers. And I won't refer to the deal specifically, but I think everyone's aware of, a recent large merger in California involving some of the, largest retailers and supply chain companies. And I think part of that impetus was companies looking at their debt stacks and looking what they had coming due and converting and talking to each other and saying, how can we together create another couple years of runway to try to ride it out, the 2-year thing, again, brighter days, wait for safe banking or whatever's going to come down the pike, wait, for bigger change, and try to hack it out and make it work. Whether that's successful or some of these other mergers are successful remains to be seen, but it's worth a shot.
Awesome, guys. Cheers to another day, California. We're going to get through this. I think we're going to open it to questions. We didn't talk about SPACs. I'm such a jerk. I'm sorry. We didn't get there. But if anybody would like to talk about SPACs, we can talk about SPACs. So opening it up. Yeah, we don't want to talk about SPACs anyway. They're stupid. Don't do them. I'm going to hand this over to Alfredo. What's the risk in SPACs?
So if you're thinking to sell to a SPAC, there's a risk that all the investors that put money into the publicly traded vehicle may not want to be in your deal. And so the risk is basically you scare away all the investors and you have to basically attract a whole bunch of new investors at the time of the deal. And so the SPAC investors are looking at all of these transactions and saying, my risk in this environment is getting too high, and you're seeing them just flip out. So flip out of the stock, not flip out mentally. In some case, both, yeah. So the risk is it's just a highly volatile vehicle to get public. Weed Maps had this big group, Silver Spike, out of New York. They had capital to do real estate, capital to do debt, and capital to acquire companies. And so investors saw mitigated risk in that opportunity when they acquired Weed Maps. And at the time, late last fall, Weed Maps and the whole sector was still on a growth trajectory. So currently, some SPACs are getting done, but the number and volume has decreased dramatically. I think the SPAC market is down 90% on volume. It's just a different way to get public and to get other investors. And in this market, it's very risky.
Yeah, I saw a few try to look at operating cannabis companies and separate out the ancillary assets and get there, and then just ultimately decide it was too much effort. So.
Yes, sir. Olympic.
I was wondering if you could comment. Is High Times a SPAC? What's your opinion on High Times?
It's not. We have an investment in them. They crowdfunded behind, so they did the new, they did the new, sorry, what was the law that came out in the Obama administration that allowed for micro investing? What was that? Anyway, it's a micro investment platform, and then they acquire businesses through stock, and then their revenue becomes part of their top line. But yeah, it's not a SPAC. Anybody else? Come on, don't be shy. Yes, ma'am.
Legality yet is sort of the first one.
I'm going to go with the interstate answer, but
Yeah, these are all good ones. It's like Family Feud, like top 5 reasons.
Do you want to repeat the question? I mean, if anybody didn't hear it, is what's the value of an IP holding company in a adult use cannabis market? And I think, Cassia, you said it, because we have federal prohibition still, and people still want to create a brand in multiple jurisdictions in a safe and effective manner, and have some brand protection doing it. So trademarks, just one component of intellectual property, right? They can be registered at both the federal and at the state levels. You probably know a lot of this, but with regard to federal trademarks, the actual activity of slinging weed is not protectable by a trademark. And at the state levels, they usually are. But the hitch is that in states, you actually have to be doing business there in order to get your trademark registration. So unlike federal law where, if you think you're going to start a company and you want to file an intent to use trademark protection and get yourself positioned to protect your brand in the market as you build capital and build clientele, you don't have that opportunity with regard to cannabis trademarks if you want to actually protect your brand. So people are trying to move into markets very specifically and intentionally so that they can file those trademark applications and then bump it up on a federal level once it is legal. And so doing that through a holding company that is able to sort of license the trademark to someone who has a production license in another state is one way to help segregate your risk of loss and liability and more easily entitle you to enter into these other markets without putting licenses in other jurisdictions at risk.
And people are trying to segregate from 280E exposure too, although there's some level of risk that, at least theoretically, that the IRS could go after an IP licensing entity under 280E too. Doesn't happen frequently.
If you're not really trying to keep these companies separate, they do like to attribute income from a related entity to another entity. So putting together an elaborate structure where you've pulled out your employees and your IP and your real estate holdings and this and that isn't always successful. I know. Yeah, right. I mean, if you're just going to have one shop, just form an LLC, elect to be taxed as a corporation and move on. But if you have bigger plans, then you really want to sit down with some advisors on kind of what the pitfalls, costs, and benefits are of all of this kind of.
Joyce had another point on that one.
Well, I think, so we have an IP company, we have a hemp company, and we have a cannabis company, and we have a vegetable company. So there's synonymy for cannabis with wellness, synonymy with food and agriculture, synonymy with, hopefully eventually retail isn't just THC. So I think that complexity also, is kind of important at this stage. I mean, who knows what California is going to do with our, I don't think CBD and THC are going to land in the same facility anytime soon, but I'm agnostic as a consumer, and so I'm trying to build my business to be agnostic based on the regulatory model that it, exists in front of me. So.
One more. You also open up yourself to a different investor pool potentially in the brand itself. People are more willing to invest in a lifestyle brand or a technology platform. Yeah.
Yeah, but keep in mind, though, marijuana-related business is a very well-defined term at the federal level, and even though you may be ancillary and investors may find an ancillary business more attractive, they are still subject to a lot of the banking regulation restrictions, and of course can't get an SBA loan and take advantage of other federal emergency relief services. So do keep that in mind. As a marijuana-related business, if you're taking money from cannabis businesses, you do qualify under that umbrella, and trying to apply for those services would be considered fraud. So you just sort of stay away. There's got to be more. We must have some. More questions. Yeah, right. So, I mean,
I don't know if you addressed this, but we're seeing other states start opening up. New York, Jersey, there seems to be a lot of energy over there. Can you speak to sort of like how you view these upcoming markets where existing operators may be able to partake or access to capital? Maybe there's a strategic relationship there. Just speak to sort of more so a lot for me at least. I'm so siloed in California. Understanding how these newer markets might be an opportunity where they're taking some of California's good pieces, and for anyone that's a California operator, maybe.
so the question is, how can California operators partner with emerging markets in other jurisdictions, like other states, and even maybe internationally? Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully, what is it? 1236 will progress through the California Senate, and will at least have authority for the governor's office to enter into interstate commerce pacts. Right now, Prop 64, as it stands, sort of prohibits that activity. So, other than this branding concept that we've been discussing, there is a limitation on that right now. But I'm watching that bill, and I have a lot of confidence that it'll actually move through. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to pass from what I've heard, but it's a little bit esoteric right now because interstate commerce isn't allowed. I think on an individual.
I don't know.
Oh, good point.
The downward clause.
For individual operators, opportunities, I'm seeing there's a lot of excitement around delivery. And a big portion of the questions I get about New York and New Jersey, because we have an office in both places actually, is, are they going to permit delivery? What's the landscape look like? Am I going to be able to have, a brand platform like I do in California there? And the regulations aren't out completely in New York, and they'll probably change, 10 times like they have in California. But there's still a lot of cachet to the California cannabis culture and the social equity programs, and at least paying lip service to those values has proliferated too. You see companies looking to recreate that model in places like New York and New Jersey. Now, there are going to be residency requirements for, majority ownership on those initial licenses that a California resident may not qualify for, but, potentially being able to export the tech platform models, advocating for delivery. I know we've seen Ease over the past couple of years lobby pretty heavily in new regulated states to try to get delivery to open it up. And it's not as good as California for the most part, but it's still early days too. So I see opportunity for that California culture to be, at least in the role of like strategic advisors or technology advisors. We've figured out how to do this here. I know that not all that tech is specific to cannabis or not able to be recreated, but it's not selling widgets or delivering widgets. And to your point, earlier, Joyce, before the session about how, you viewed some of the delivery companies proliferating here and the way that it's gone and kind of devaluing the plant and the service in some ways. Kind of interesting perspective too, and whether that will be replicated in other markets. But I think people are going to continue want to see California genetics, California tech, California delivery models replicated, and people really want to see the East Coast market start to look like this, and they'll be pushing on it to happen. I don't know if other folks have insight on that.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Thanks for bringing that up, Cassia. One of the things I was saying was, I've been able to look under the covers of a few things, but for a long time, I've just not understood why we're recreating the Amazon model in cannabis. Like, these businesses are like teaching consumers practices that are not realistic to how cannabis is delivered and how to be able to make profit off of actually delivering. You know, I mean, from a metrics perspective, you have to do about 8 to 9 deliveries at about $75 to $80 an hour to be able to pay your person, you know, $20 an hour. And there's very few geographic, you know, mixes in California that like add that number of consumers. And, you know, set aside, what if there's traffic? What if you get a ticket? What if, you know, whatever. So I don't know. I just like would like to have a company that realistically says we're not going to exist simply as a data play, but we're going to exist as a functional, you know, resource, because I don't see Amazon purchasing any of these companies in the short term. So anyway, that's my soapbox. But one of the things that I wanted to add on the genetics side is, you know, I do think Alfredo alluded to cookies earlier, and, you know, obviously they've sort of been the poster child for how to expand a brand across the globe. One thing I've started to see sort of dissipate their value in certain areas is like picking the wrong operator to partner with. So, you know, Washington, a lot of OG people are like, cookies up here isn't good. Like, we don't like cookies. They're only viable on the West Coast, the east side of the state, you know. So I think, you know, genetics companies will have a really good opportunity. California still historically, I mean, it's the best place to grow, and we've got the longest term, you know, history of building great genetics category. So if you're like not even just a brand, not even just cultivator, like a brand, like Cosmic View has Pink Goddess that keeps winning the Emerald Cup, that's like THCV forward. Like, if you're a brand, find a really cool cultivator that has like a crazy, like, I personally think we're gonna start going in like 3-to-1, 1-to-1. Like, it's not just gonna stay like 35% THC potency, because people probably in, you know, Minnesota and Michigan maybe don't want to get that blasted. I mean, maybe some of them do, but like at the end of the day, if you can find a partner that's doing something really special that you then put into your brand, and then the two of you go and you say, hey, we've got this really awesome like pink Buddhist goddess that's won the Emerald Cup every fucking year, and I can put it in all these cool form factors, you're not going to be able to recreate that in New York. License it. So.
Yeah. Like where,
Yeah,
like,
totally.
Yeah, and that's where licensing comes in, or yeah. And thanks to Shane Pennington, right, we have clarity on the fact that you could ship seeds. Right? Now, like, seeds, there's no source rule, essentially, when it comes to this one component. So crazy. It's not completely dead. I mean, it's just this one component. But but you can ship seeds. So this is a viable way to enter a market. I love that idea.
Okay, the question is, where are we going with consumption and events? Another place where California is leading, and I wish we could get more local governments and venues and their insurers on board, because there's nothing but excitement, I think, out there from so many sources. And I've worked on a lot of special events in California, and we've tried to push legislation in other states too. And I think that innovation needs to come from here, because this is the home of that culture, and it's working. Like, the events that are being held, I didn't make it up, but I saw that you all had a wonderful event outside here. Yeah, just last week, right? Yeah, and that sort of thing is really exciting, and that's going to push the culture and awareness forward. And we honestly, the legal framework for it is pretty good here. It's kind of getting more local governments comfortable with it, and then a big holdup has been the individual venues. The alcohol permitting is something that we can resolve, but if the venue can't get over it because they have contracts with so-and-so or they don't want to be associated with it, That's been a holdup for indoor stuff. But I'm very bullish on it, and I think that that's another way for California to lead.
I agree. And as we move more and more toward, delivery models just in general, I think you're going to find that it's going to be a necessary component for some of the retailers in order to survive. And it kind of goes back to that thing that Will was talking about earlier, making yourself stand out, make yourself different, create an experience for your consumer, because they can kind of get the same products in a lot of places, but they won't be able to recreate the look and the feel of the experience that you can provide them with, including knowledgeable staff and a comfortable, safe space to consume outside of a potentially rented apartment or Section 8 housing, right? So it really is, I think, the future.
We need more consumption lounges.
Like at events that aren't licensed. Yeah.
So I just was wondering how you guys feel about that. And I'm actually launching delivery in the Sacramento area, but I'm also wanting to apply for my event license. But we're restrained to only use Cal Expo, which is a huge venue that costs just really outside of where I'm at. So just looking at those options. But how do you guys feel about that whole? I think it's the ice cream style incorporating with the
Yeah, I mean, the state regulations don't restrict it, in my opinion. I would look at how the local government handles things. It comes down to primarily local and law enforcement, if they even have a bead on it. And I'm talking about specific delivery to, like, Cinespia in LA, like a movie night or something, or a party that's not a licensed event. The delivery regulations are pretty open on it. You just have to deliver to a physical address, right? Storefront retailers, sometimes, and I'm sure there's storefront retailers in the crowd, so I'm not taking a position on this whether it's good or bad, I guess, but they'll sometimes file complaints about it. So I would be familiar with the neighborhood and the area, and also where the local government stands on things. Like talking to your regulators, always a good idea. For the most part in California, people are pretty cool with it. The other thing I would say is private events here are, for the most part, cool and not big problems, as long as you're responsible, keep things in hand, and just be correct about how you're doing it. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, in my opinion. Yeah, good luck.
I have a question. I've been in the cannabis industry for 4 years, and I'm still co-leading the company that I co-founded. And I'm curious your perspective on the changing face of the labor force in cannabis over the last 3 to 5 years, because there's a lot of things burning up, and I think a lot of new people, maybe still new people coming, or are there people who came to the cannabis industry that are leaving? Because there are people that I don't see, what's going on with the labor force? Also, the fact that nobody mentions that the labor force, nobody knows what the fuck they're doing.
I think that's a problem beyond cannabis, right? The American workforce kind of just hanging out here, I guess. I don't know.
On a beautiful Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, on that, this is somewhat tangential, but the new proposed trailer bill this year is going to take the LPA requirement down to 10, I think, from 22, and says that they're going to put some teeth in it, like fining people who are aiding and abetting companies trying to get out of the requirement, which was, obviously
Directed at a particular
well. Yeah, I can't really speak to the labor force because I'm not a cannabis employer. But.
Here's what I'm going to say. The Bay Area Community College just started a certification program that is going to include special market expert oversight. And so I think we're going to be in a chapter where the young people are going to get to start trained towards this, and it's up to us as an industry to sort of like lean in and kind of build that, protocol. Relative to my experience, thank God for immigrants, like, frankly, I mean, to me, like, we work with so many people in the wine area, and they are the lifeblood of the agriculture. And so, I want to push to make sure that, like, we treat people in California with respect. But the overriding labor, like, I feel like if you're like, kind of like a somewhat seasoned professional, that it doesn't own your own company or have, a fair amount of stock in your company, you're probably exiting cannabis right now. So the pool of people to be looking at are going to be those that you're going to be trying to like grow into that group.
So I think we kind of did a couple of things after Prop 64. We got away from really treating our employees like they should know something about the plant when they talk to people, because we got away from the medicinal component of it in large part. I think that Oaksterdam still provides a lot of really good educational content that, quote unquote, bud tenders or retail employees should be taking. I also think that we've experienced a bit of a turnover just as an industry. So a lot of people who, worked in dispensaries under 215 just couldn't really fit under 64. It just was too rigid for them. It was too regulated, and they exited. And so we have experienced definitely a huge turnover in our employee type and our employee base. I think we need to get back to the educational component of it in a huge way. And I think efforts like what WHO is doing in relation to pushing compassionate programs and medicinal access are going to be key to keeping that in the forefront of people's minds and teaching them more than indica and sativa, which really kind of isn't a thing. And talking a little bit more about this beautiful plant and getting deep into what it means to people's lives and sort of how it might affect those around you. So I think there's a lot we can do, but I do want to applaud those efforts on the medicinal access component, because I think that that's important to getting our employee base back to where it should be. My 2 cents.
I think we're a wrap, y'all. I have to shout out a group that I co-founded called the Cannabis Media Council. Meadow is one of the founding members. Thank you, guys. So basically, we are trying to end the media moratorium against this plant by putting forward, educational destigmatization commercial efforts. So we've got about 50 members strong, and you can check out cannabismediacouncil.com and find more information. This is a long journey, so join us. Yeah. Yeah, or how about NPR and like everybody, let's stop saying pot. We don't put pot and pot on my farm, so.